further. Their third speaker is Annette Yeoh. The reply speech will also be made by Samuel Whitberger. In opposition today, we have a team from River Valley High School. Their first speaker is Isaac Tan. Their second speaker is Ng Jia Min. Apologies, Ng Jia Min. And their third speaker is Dion Ho. The reply speech will also be made by Isaac Tan. The speaking time for the substantive speeches is 8 minutes. The bell will be rung once like this. At the first minute, to signify that the speakers from the other team may give points of information. It will also be rung once at the 7th minute to indicate to the other team to please giving points of information. The bell will be rung twice at the 8th minute. After 8 minutes and the 15 seconds have elapsed, the bell will be rung continuously and the speaker will be expected to immediately conclude his or her speech. At the end of the 8-minute substantive speeches, the teams will deliver their reply speeches. The opposition reply speaker will deliver his speech first, followed by the proposition reply speaker, who will conclude the debate. Each reply speech will last for 4 minutes. The bell will be rung once at the 3rd minute of the reply speech and twice at the 4th minute of the speech to signal to the speaker that he or she should end the speech. No points of information can be given throughout the entire reply speech. To avoid any disruption during the debate, the audience is gently reminded to switch off all electronic and mobile devices or turn them onto silent mode. In addition, we request that the audience will only leave the room in between speeches so as to not distract the speakers. May I now call upon the first speaker of the proposition to begin today's debate.
Because a crime of omission is the same as a crime of commission. The blood of the innocent cannot be on our hands. And that is why we have never been more proud to propose military support for the Syrian rebels. Let's begin with a few key definitions. The Western powers refer to the developed nations in the Western Hemisphere who wield considerable political and military influence within the international system, with the unique ability to project said power overseas and distribute resources abroad through a variety of channels. And examples of these Western powers include France, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, which in particular runs on a defense budget of $600 billion per annum, therefore indicating how well equipped it is to take action not only at home, but also overseas. Conversely, the rebels in Syria refer to the groups of individuals and militia fighting against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And this Syrian civil war has been fought since 2011, and as it stands, the rebels are fighting a losing battle. The problem that both sides in today's debate face is this: no thank you. We see that the dictatorial al-Assad government has escalated its campaign against the rebels, using airstrikes and the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons like chlorine and nerve gas in contravention of international convention. And they have recaptured the rebel stronghold of Homs using all of these illegitimate tactics. Rebels and innocent civilians alike are subject to these atrocities and dying in the hundreds of thousands. Current action by the Western powers, which has been limited so far to diplomatic posturing and official censure, no thank you, has been completely ineffective in stemming this threat, and we hence see the need to move onwards to military support. Yes, sir.
If your issue is with the brutal treatment of all these innocent civilians, we believe that all these rebel groups are equally guilty of mistreating all these civilians in Syria.
Sir, the rebels don't have an incentive to act in this manner, but even if we accept that they do employ such tactics, our policy is even better, as we provide incentive for these rebels to adhere to international rules of engagement, as I will elaborate further in our stance. Now, moving back to our definition of military support, that is, the provision of assistance and resources to augment the rebels' warfighting capabilities. And this can manifest itself as the provision of small arms, funding and training to the rebels, or the supplying of intelligence, as well as the enforcement of a no-fly zone over Syria to prevent airstrike action. And this would all be conducted with the presence of Western oversight. We're going to give you the earlier example of Libya, where Western military support was provided to the Libyan rebels, which therefore ensured the successful overthrow of the regime of Muammar Gaddafi and the installation of a new transitional government. No thank you. And we see that this ancillary support action actually mitigates the need for a full-scale military intervention down the road in terms of committing troops on the ground, because we strengthen the rebels already invested in the conflict and therefore remove any need for the Western powers to dedicate their own resources on the ground. And we further clarify that this support is likely to be conditional on the rebels adhering to internationally recognized rules of engagement, because this is what the Western powers themselves value. No thank you. Thus ensuring that they stick to legitimate tactics or risk losing this extremely important external support. That's their earlier point of information answered. This debate is hence about which side best solves or ameliorates the Syrian civil war, and in the best interest of the Syrian people. And it must be noted that in addition to debating which solution is the most practical, we also need to consider the principal justification for pursuing this course of action as well. And to this end, proposition has 5 key arguments. Firstly, on saving lives. Secondly, on regional stability, and thirdly, on setting a strong precedent against dictatorships. Well, my second speaker will continue, hold on a moment, on upholding international law and on fostering better relations with the Islamic world. Yes, sir.
Sir, if you are so concerned about saving lives, why are you trying to extend this war for another 3 years?
So what we're actually trying to do is shorten the war. Because currently, while your side advocates for a quick solution, it's a quick solution that results in the death of countless civilians, the quashing of rebels, and any democratic voice that exists in Syria. We believe that this is a completely abhorrent solution that your side is advocating for. On the converse side, by the provision of Western military support, we give these rebels the ability to actually fight this war and the capability to eventually prevail. And this therefore shortens human suffering, or at least reduces it on the whole. I'm now transitioning to my first constructive argument on saving lives. The thesis of this being that extending military support fulfills the moral obligation of the Western powers to uphold the sanctity of life. We see the current disorder of the Syrian civil war stems from the enormous military advantage that the al-Assad regime holds over the rebels. And on their side, they allow al-Assad to continue running rampant and continue this massacre. Conversely, the extension of Western support corrects the power asymmetry that exists through the considerable resources that the Western powers themselves uniquely possess, because it augments the capability of the rebels themselves to detect threats to their personnel, training in order to fend off attacks, and equipment in order to adopt countermeasures to chemical and air attacks that the regime is raining down upon them. And in itself, this already reduces casualties, both rebels and civilians, on the ground. Even then, this is reinforced in principle by the obligation that all nation states hold to preserve the right to life, that all people, including the Syrian rebels and civilians, are entitled to. It's enshrined in international conventions like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the Western powers have pledged themselves to and have overtly recognized through their extension of diplomatic means in order to resolve the conflict. However, when we consider that 500,000 people have already died over the course of the Syrian conflict, how other measures have already failed, we hence see a principal justification for Western military support to be employed in order to continue upholding the right to and defending the interests of lives. Moving on to our next argument on fostering regional stability. The thesis of this is that Western military support prevents the extension of a radical extremist threat into Syria, which is better for security in the Middle East. Because we recognize that in the absence of Western military support, Syrian rebels are likely to turn to other forms of aid and assistance in order to bolster their already flagging campaign. And the only alternative that exists in status quo is Islamic fundamentalist forces that are already present. And because of this, the rebels will succeed in overthrowing the al-Assad regime, but inadvertently expose themselves to the influence and leverage of these Islamic forces. And the end point of this is that you create a rogue Islamic state that is predisposed against the Western powers for their failure to help. Even if the rebels don't succeed, the involvement of Islamists becomes a golden propaganda opportunity, a valiant cause that motivates other individuals to join this radicalist cause, and because of this, global terrorism escalates. On the comparative, our side provides support and with it Western oversight, which provides a guiding force preventing this extension of extremism. And for example, the current lack of support by the Western powers in Syria has caused Hezbollah to enter the country. Hezbollah and numerous al-Qaeda offshoots are now active in that region, and we need to counteract this insidious threat. Moving on to my final argument on setting a strong precedent against dictators. And this argument quite simply proves that Western support establishes a strong stance of the international community against dictatorships. Because in the absence of Western support, dictatorships are given carte blanche to continue their punitive tactics, because they see the refusal of the West to take concrete action beyond diplomatic channels, thereby giving them free license to continue exploiting their people. More people die as a consequence. On our side, we establish a strong precedent for Western support against dictatorships, which keeps them in check by providing an enormous psychological obstacle against their abuses. For example, when the United Nations failed to pass a resolution for the invasion of Zimbabwe and the overthrow of Robert Mugabe in 2008, it only led to increased human rights abuses when Mugabe felt empowered in the absence of Western action. We don't want to cultivate this unhealthy mindset in the minds of despots, and for all of the above reasons, we are proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the first speaker of the opposition to give his speech.
Arm Syrians, to kill Syrians, so as to protect Syrians. That's the line side proposition is running today. We think it's something really ridiculous, something we stand against. So side proposition has painted this picture of escalated attacks, airstrikes, and chemical weapon abuses. Now, firstly, we feel that chemical weapon abuses and airstrikes are thing of the past, right? Because clearly we've seen Russia stepping in, Putin setting up an independent body to take all these chemical weapons away, such that Syria right now is only left with 3% of its stockpile of what it originally had. And Assad, on the other hand, is willing to hand over this 3% anyway. So we think that what they are doing, or the picture that they are painting, is something of the past, and that when you arm all these rebels, you necessarily negate all the negotiation efforts that have been going on so far. We think that negotiations are great, that they are being driven in the right direction. So let's start off by asking a very simple question. What does team opposition want? Team opposition wishes to see Assad in power. This way, we can hold someone accountable through geopolitical pressure from Russia and China. We will urge Assad to stop any violence or human rights abuses
Point of
that
information,
he is
sir.
accused of, and we think that Assad will comply because he's an individual open to compromise based on historic precedents. We saw Syria having its use of chemical weapons condemned by Russia, and then admit its mistakes, and then surrendering them to the Putin administration for confiscation. We see Bashar Jafari, the foreign minister, telling the public about how they regret the use of chemical weapons and it being a last resort, and therefore are willing to change and stop all these human rights abuses and make corrective effort. And this year, in fact, we saw Syria having an election, and we think that it's a trend that Syria is ultimately moving forward to democracy. And we think it's easier on the hand to hold one person, Bashar al-Assad, responsible, as opposed to the many leaders of the many different rebel factions that will come into power when you topple the Assad regime. Then I'm going to ask the second question. What are rebels like? We tell you that rebels aren't a monolithic bloc. They consist of independent, disunited factions like the Latakia League of Independence or the Free Syrian Army, and even radical factions of Al-Qaeda. Because of the different goals and religious aims, all these many factions pop up, and different groups often splinter into these small factions. We tell you that rebels also include Syrian warlords that are greedy for power and fighting for ground to entrench their power after the Assad regime has toppled. Rebels are faceless groups without a de facto leader on a whole, and nobody can hold one leader accountable for the sins the rebel on a whole has caused. We think it's hard to pinpoint their mistakes and hard to hold them accountable, like side proposition would like us to believe. And we tell you that because these rebels have fought hard and lost men, that they would ultimately want the goal and cause they fought for to succeed and met. Therefore, they would attempt to seize power and seize control of the regime. We tell you that there will be more power struggle after the regime has collapsed. There will be infighting, and we think this is something extremely bad. So I'm going to ask the second question. What are the consequences of arming the rebels? Under that, I have three substantives. Firstly, on the point of more bloodshed. Secondly, on the creation of fundamentalist groups. Thirdly, on internationalizing the conflict. I'll flash my substantive. I'll take it in a moment, sir, with the substantive of first proposition. But before that, yes, sir.
Last week, a suburb in Damascus was gassed, killing 1,200 civilians. Your change regime did this. Can a disassembled weapon actually do that?
Well, the first question we need to ask then is who is the one in charge of the attacks? And clearly we see it's the radical factions of the rebel groups that are in charge of these attacks, that are perpetrating these attacks, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let them fool you into thinking that the Assad regime is reclining into its old ways of using chemical weapons. It's clearly the rebels of today that are radical, whose aims are not being met, who are not involved in negotiations, that have to resort to such attacks. So they've given us this substantive of regional stability, right? They say that if the US don't fund these rebel groups, that terrorists will. Ultimately, these terrorists are these rebel groups are terrorists themselves, right? They get support from, they are part of different factions of Al-Qaeda and ultimately get their arms from Al-Qaeda, right? We think that these are radical people that we must prepare of. So let me now move on to my first substantive on how there will be more bloodshed. The conflict in Syria, we feel, is already standing down, as I proved to you very earlier on. The prospect of a ceasefire is more likely negotiations between Assad and the different representatives of the moderate rebel groups. Now, when you arm the rebels, you will be arming radical groups in this case, because moderate factions are already having their demands being met through, like, one of the aims of the moderate faction being the Assad's surrender of chemical weapons, right? We think it's the radical factions who are not engaged in negotiations, like the Latakia League of Independence, whose aim is to kill every standing Alawite, and that is not being met. We think that it's a legitimate issue. It's we should allow for these radical aims to not be met, right? Because these radical aims involve like killing of human lives. You cannot meet these aims. So if you want to topple the regime on side proposition, right, you have to arm the radical groups, because now these radical groups are the only groups that have a cause worth fighting for. But looking into the future, when the Assad regime is toppled, right, we think that minority Christian and Alawite communities will be massacred by fundamentalist groups because Assad's national military cannot now protect them. Assad can't intervene to protect his people. And we feel, right, that more have died in the 3 years of civil strife than in the entire reign of Assad. This is very telling of how war is so bad and that we should not prolong the conflict by arming the radical rebels. So I move on into my second substantive of the creation of fundamentalist military groups. We tell you that military support often involves giving arms like 50 caliber rifles, grenade launchers, mortar launchers, as well as training in which the Mujahideen received training by the CIA. They were taught how to strategically attack troops. They were taught US control patterns and routines of CIA methods. And on-site proposition, in fact, they would add an additional tier and give military intelligence to all these rebel groups. We think it's something really dangerous, right? And we think that the training that you provide for these rebels is impossible to take back after the wars. And arms in and on itself is something that is extremely difficult to retrieve, because hiding them is so easy, because there's so much intransparency and unaccountability, right? We feel that when you have all these factions using arms, you plant the seeds for religious fundamentalism. And we saw this happen clearly in Afghanistan, where the Mujahideens were trained by the CIA, in Pakistan, where the American funded the ISI, which ultimately resulted in bomb-making Pakistans carrying out acts of terror. And on the third point, a very short one, on internationalizing the conflict, we see that currently, right, there's an agreement between USA, Russia, and all the different states to stay neutral on this conflict. When the West arms the rebels, right, China and Russia will then have to step in to protect the Assad regime as they've been pledging. We think that when you do that, you internationalize the conflict, you drag superpowers into the conflict, and you lengthen the conflict by continuously allowing the sale of arms to the different sides in this conflict. And we think, right, that you also embolden the Assad regime now that you allow China and Russia to give Assad's government the arms that they need to fight. Because currently we see Russia and China condemning Assad's efforts, right, So that means that Assad is not willing to attack, and he wishes to not be the evil person. So ultimately, we feel that their policy on side proposition is really unnecessary, and we stand by less bloodshed.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the second speaker of the proposition to give his speech.
We don't really know what the world that opposition is living in, because they claim that chemical weapons and human rights violations are a thing of the past for the Assad regime. Well, let's look at reality. Simply last week, chlorine gas was used against the rebels by the Assad regime. Homs, a rebel stronghold, was captured with military action under the direction of the Assad regime as well. Very clearly, Assad himself has not changed, but even if for some reason we assume he has changed, we cannot stand by all the actions he has already committed, which were already in direct contravention of every single international principle that the international community prides itself upon. And it's because of that we cannot allow the West to continue to stand by this person whom they, by all other principles, would have stood against. Therefore, we're going to take apart their case in 3 points of contention. First, about which side actually creates more bloodshed. Second, about this notion of fundamentalism and what are the ramifications for the region. And third, on this notion of internationalizing the conflict. I'll also be dealing with what they didn't deal with from my first speaker. First, on more bloodshed. The very simple premise of their argument was that they rather had compromised than war. Let's first assume, is a compromise even possible? The reason why there are so many rebel groups, 23 as a matter of fact, is not because they took this as an opportunity to suddenly launch their attacks against the Assad regime. It's very simple. The gross amount of human rights violations that have taken place against the entirety of the populace has become one uniting goal amongst all of the disparate groups. So yes, no thank you. We recognize they have their own separate aims, but if there's one thing that unites them, it is this desire to see Assad himself removed. By their policy, the West supports Assad and denies all of them their right to self-determination. No thank you, sir. Why is this a terrible thing? Apart from the fact that this only increases the likelihood of the war continuing for more than the 3 years it already has been, it also means, no thank you, that there's going to be increasing terrorism against the West. This is a terrible thing. I'm going to cover this in my second point of contention right now, on fundamentalism. Now, what they assumed is that you're going to be creating even more fundamentalist groups, and you only want to talk to us about groups like the Al-Qaeda. Yes, we recognize that currently there are groups like the Al-Qaeda present in Syria. But the reason why they have been there is because the West has been unwilling to support these rebel groups in the first place. That is why they've had no other alternative but to turn to the only terrorist groups which are able to provide them with some form of training and support. No thank you, sir. Provide them with arms, the necessary information to enable them to launch their attack against Assad. We have to understand, these are rebel groups which have been fighting for the past 3 years because they want to see Assad removed. It is completely simplistic for opposition to assume that suddenly these groups are all going to cave in and stop their 3-year war against the Assad regime. Go ahead.
If all the groups are fighting for the sole purpose against human rights violations, why are there so many factions instead of one united faction fighting for the one aim you were talking about?
So we understand that there are various disparate aims as well. Unfortunately, there's one thing that coalesces all of them. So yes, while at the same time you want to fight for various goals, there's one thing that unites them. So if there's one thing that they have to settle for, it will be the removal of Assad. Compare this to your side, where the West continues to support Assad, and therefore you have no resolution, possibly spawning even more groups in the process fighting against the regime. We think it's much worse. Third point of contention, therefore, on internationalizing the conflict. Basically what they told us is that countries in the West, like the US, Russia, as well as China, have agreed to not take a stance. Well, we think that's a terrible thing. By not intervening in Syria through a variety of means, be it through support or interventions as well, we think that it has created even more problems for Syria. The reason being this, that Assad has basically had carte blanche to do whatever he wants. Why is it worse on their side of the house? When they explicitly give Western approval for Assad to continue all these human rights violations, it means that there's absolutely no incentive for any of these things to stop. And here's where we're going to be dealing with what my first speaker told on saving lives. Why was this important? Because when we're able to aid the rebels, what we essentially do is enhance their capabilities in this what is otherwise asymmetrical warfare, enabling them with the necessary technology to be able to put out necessary defense and to continue their attack on the Assad regime. We recognize that this fight is not going to stop until the Assad regime has been toppled, simply by the fact it has already been going on for the past 3 years. What is more important is that they completely dropped my first speaker's argument on setting a very strong precedent against dictators. Why is this important? Because when we send in military support for all these rebels, we send a very strong message to the international community, especially dictators who currently remain in power, that no, your actions are not legitimate and we will take a concrete stance against you. This is good not just for Syria, but for other dictatorships as well. Contrast this to their side, where Western support of Assad just means that every single dictator has carte blanche to do anything he wants in oppressing his people. We think that's a terrible thing. With that, I'm moving on to my first point, constructive, on upholding international law. Yes, sir.
Sir, you say that the Western powers are supporting Syria. That is simply not true. The US almost wanted to carry out an air shot on Syria, but was only stopped because of China and Russia.
Yes, and we think it was unfortunate that they didn't do it because they should have. That is exactly what our side is standing for. We recognize that the West doesn't support it, but we think that they should. That's why on our side, we're going to be upholding international law, as I'm going to be bringing it to you now. Now, the first of my argument is that international law is currently being violated and trampled upon, and the international community has done absolutely nothing about it. How is this so? When Bashar al-Assad started using chemical weapons in 2012, he violated both the Hague and the Geneva Conventions, international agreements that govern the types of acts in war that are criminal and strictly prohibited. Western powers such as Russia threatened the invasion to stop the use of chemical weapons. But unfortunately, Assad resumed the use of chlorine gas in early 2013 up till this point in time. The international community since then, including Western powers, has done absolutely nothing. Now, why is this a bad thing? When international conventions only draw their legitimacy from the recognition and upholding of them. When one nation acts in direct contravention of all these international principles, and the international community refuses to do anything to correct this, what essentially happens is that the very meaning and purpose of all these conventions is destroyed. This is a terrible thing, practically speaking, because there is then no incentive for any nation to abide by this now and in the future, and therefore any abrogations of this are likely to occur in the more likely to occur rather in the future. There's now nothing stopping current dictators from using such chemical weapons in the future because international conventions are seen as having no purpose and hence no one to act against it. By comparison, when the West provides military support to the rebels, it is a strong show of action and a tough stance against the blatant disregard of international conventions that protect lives in the process. Therefore, we would provide military support to the rebels. Second argument, on better relations with the Islamic world. This also is going to counter everything that they told us about fundamentalism. Now, the underpinning of this argument is that military support is the best way to cultivate a healthy relationship with the Islamic world. Why is this case? No. In the status quo, a significant part of the Islamic world already has a fervent hatred for the West, which is seen currently as having infringed on their right through botched operations and the support of the Israelis. They are particularly incensed because the West claims to be a bastion of human rights, yet doesn't act in the same capacity. Providing military support to the rebels is therefore the best opportunity to rectify this, because the Western powers can now uphold human rights by aiding the rebels and stand against the human rights violations by the Assad regime. And we saw success of this. After American support for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 2011, Egyptian imams revoked a fatwa against the West, revealing how their stance has become significantly less antagonistic. And a better relationship with the Islamic world is imperative in a world where religiously motivated terror has reached unknown peaks. Therefore, to reduce the incidence of terrorism, this is a policy which must be undertaken, saving lives and creating a healthier and more amicable relationship with the Islamic world in the process. Therefore, because a crime of omission is worse than a crime of commission, we are incredibly proud to stand in proposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the second speaker of the opposition to give his speech.
when you arm Syrians to kill Syrians, to protect Syrians, bad things happen. We've seen things like this happen in the past, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in so many examples that ISAC has brought to you, but were not acknowledged by side proposition. Today, I'll deal with three main questions. First and foremost, how are these rebel groups like? Second of all, what's best for the international community? And third of all, what's best for Syria? First question, how are these rebel groups like? Under this, they've given us two lines of analysis. First, these rebel groups are innocent, they oppress people under Assad's regime. First and foremost, we contest this characterization altogether. These rebel groups, ladies and gentlemen, are not innocent. They're just about as guilty as Bashar al-Assad is in committing all these terrible atrocities against innocent Syrians. We say that all these rebel groups have very disparate interests and they have the common goal of killing the Alawite minorities in Syria because of its association with the Alawite regime. So what have they done, ladies and gentlemen? In the past, they've done this. They've committed arson against property in Damascus because Damascus is dominated by Alawites. They've committed murder and manslaughter against innocent Alawite Muslims in Syria. This is all the atrocities that they are doing. And we say that if their side is going to stand by international law and all these lofty ideals of the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, we say that they should not legitimize their cause at all by providing weapons to all these murderers with blood on their hands. So, second line of logic. They say that all these rebels have a common desire to see Assad removed while having very disparate aims. First and foremost, we say that their side is myopic by just focusing on one small little element in a larger picture where they all have different goals, different aims, and ultimately different modus operandi. Why is this harmful? We see that what happens when we have to acknowledge that Syria is a very, very diverse place. Syria consists of different ethnic groups like the Armenians, the Kurds, the Bedouin Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs. Yes, it consists of different religious groups. So what happened on their side, by providing arms to all these disparate groups of rebel groups, we say that on the first tier, they will not be able to achieve their aim of toppling Assad in the first place because all these rebel groups have different modes of operation. Some of them resort to guerrilla tactics. Some of them resort to openly fighting the Syrian army. We say that this diminishes the efficacy of a combined force. Second line of logic, even if we assume that their side is going to work, that they are going to somehow topple the Assad regime, we say that this is bad for Syria. Why so? Because in the direct aftermath of the conflict, we say that all these groups will start infighting and this will contribute to more chaos and bloodshed. We say this is already ongoing in Syria, where the Kurds is directly fighting against the Free Syrian Army because they want their own state. We say that the Latakia League of Independence is fighting for Latakian separatism. We say that they have all these different motivations and they are already infighting. There's no way to unite them. But before that, you disagree.
On our side, the provision of help is tied to abiding by international principles of code of conduct in warfare. Therefore, rebels abide by them. And on your side, there's no incentive to do so. Therefore, the war.
So tell me in principle, does killing innocent Alawite Sunni Muslims is covered by international law as something that's innocent? Now, moving on to my second area of contention on international, on this entire lofty principle of what's best for international community. I won't be spending too much time because I believe it's a red herring. We do not need to delve into this too much. The argument under this is that they want to foster better relations with the Islamic world. First and foremost, what they are essentially saying is that they want to be BFFs with Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Taliban. We think that that's completely ridiculous. On the second tier, we say that this Islamic fundamentalism will still be ongoing because we have rogue states like Iran, we have like rogue organizations like Hamas, etc. We contest their characterization, and we say that the Islamic world is so complex that there's a Sunni-Shia split. We say that their side is not going to address all these problems. Now, the second tier, the second red herring that they've thrown to us, right, is this. They say that it sets a strong precedence against dictatorships, and they accuse us of not dealing with this. First and foremost, we say that it's not the role of all these Western powers to be the arbiter of what form of ideology or political structure is viable. We say that all these Western powers, right, they in fact had very, very shady stances in the past. Why is it that Syria's dictatorship is not viable while they are explicitly having trade relations with dictatorships in Nicaragua, in Chile, and they have also historically sanctioned dictatorships in other parts of the world? We say that that's extremely hypocritical on their part. Second tier, we say we cannot ensure that the new government that's going to be set up by all these rebels will not be a dictatorship. We say that the Latakia League of Independence explicitly wants to have a theocracy where they oppress the Shia Muslims. We say that that's completely
ridiculous that their side is equally complicit in legitimizing dictatorships. But now moving on to a more important area of contention, right, on what is best for Syria. We think that this is extremely important because ultimately this conflict is about Syria. This conflict is not a conflict about what the US wants or what China wants. We say that this conflict is about people dying on the ground and what is best in the long term for Syria's development. So under this tier, their only line of analysis is that their side is somehow able to save lives because they are making this conflict more symmetrical. First and foremost, we contest that, as Isaac has already mentioned, more lives have been lost in the past 3 years of fighting than all 30 years combined of Hafez al-Assad's regime and Bashar al-Assad's regime. What does that say about their case? We say that their case is going to protract all this fighting. We say that their case is going to cause more bloodshed by forcing all these moderate rebels to take up the radical cause because they now have the means to do so, and by emboldening radical rebel groups to actually continue fighting. We say that their side will protract the conflict, their side will cause more bloodshed. And this is where I integrate this into my substantive, right, on how their side directly contravenes all current efforts at negotiation. What do we see in status quo? We say negotiations are working. We say the rebel groups, right, they have been moderating because after losing Homs, and the rebel groups based in Alpo have been expressing their direct inclination to reconcile with the Assad regime. What is the Assad regime doing? We say the Assad regime realizes from diplomatic pressure from the West and from China and Russia, who have condemned the Assad regime after the chemical weapons attack, that it has to moderate, it has to reconcile with all these rebel groups. So what we see happening is reduced chemical weapons to 3%. What we see happening is that the Assad regime is still hiring school teachers in Damascus. What we see happening is that people on the ground are starting to function again, that infrastructure is rebuilding, that Syria is starting to move on the right track again. Why does, so we argue that negotiations are extremely important in this scenario because of 3 reasons. First, negotiations does not involve arms, there would be minimal bloodshed involved, and then ultimately it will lead to a more peaceful outcome. Second, negotiations will entail certain international checks and balances that will ensure for Syria's long-term stability. Third of all, that it allows for dialogue for minority rights, especially in a country as diverse as Syria, where their side will allow another dominant minority to just rise up to power and continue oppressing all the Armenians, the Palestinians, and the Bedouin Arabs in Syria. So we see that what's going on their side is that their side is going to wipe out the possibility of negotiation. Because on the Assad tier, Assad loses the reason to negotiate because the Western Bloc is now taking military action against Syria. And China and Russia, as Isaac has already characterized, will retaliate by funding the Assad regime. On the second tier, we see that all these rebel groups will see this as a revival of their cause and will continue militarizing and attacking the Assad regime and diminishing all chances of negotiation. We see that what their side stands for is a short-term solution that does not address Syria's true needs and wants. What their side stands for is a Syria that's disunited and protracted in years and years of infighting. What their side wants is to convert Syria into another Israel. We cannot stand for that. We stand for a Syria that's peaceful in the long term.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the third speaker of the opposition to give her speech.
Opposition's entire logic has been premised on the idea that these rebels have committed severe human rights abuses, atrocities within Syria. On the proposition, we already told you that the converse thing to do is to ensure that they abide by international law, given the provision of crucial assistance for rebels is conditional upon their adherence to international law. This was something opposition never ever once understood and never ever once responded to throughout the line. This is something, therefore, they concede that the rebels will do. Therefore, this is the only way to incentivize the rebels to actually adhere to international law and solve all the problems that opposition was talking about. But more than that, opposition already was placed he has already committed, and we need to hold him accountable. With that framework in mind, let's examine today's debate in two main points of contention. Firstly, on what's best to end the war as soon as possible, and secondly, on what's best for the future. On the first point, on what's best to end the war. After this was out, I just started. On the first point, on what's best on saving lives. Here, the only response was, it's a thing of the past. Firstly, we already told you on a factual level that's simply not true, and we gave you numerous examples for this. But we're going to tell you that even if it's a thing of the past, we cannot risk the propensity of abuse for Assad to once again revert to his old ways because he sees the international community as being weak and giving in to his demands, and therefore the ball is in his court because he controls all the negotiations. We cannot risk that sort of abuse. They tried to give us the example of the rigged elections where they claimed that democratic. Assad claimed 98% of the votes. We don't think that was very democratic at all. In fact, shows all the more greater need for intervention now because Assad is going to cement his power for another 7 years because he just won the rigged election. But then they tried to tell us that more people have died within the span of 3 years than they have in the past 30 years. Let's examine why, even if we acknowledge that this was the case. This is because the people have recently gotten the courage to actually rise up against Assad. Therefore, given that framework that they already have had the courage to rise up against Assad, all the more the international community should affirm their beliefs and aid them in the toppling of Bashar al-Assad. And that's why we need to step in now, given all the sacrifices that these rebel groups have already made, given their own context. No, thank you, sir. Given their own context of the own in these particular 3 years. Conversely, on opposition side, they undo all the good and all the opposition that has been rising up within these recent years because they see the international community as refusing to affirm their beliefs, and therefore they see this as a lost cause. The number of lives simply doesn't mean that it's a good thing because it means that the people are all the more oppressed within society. On the next idea, which was their second speaker substantive on how negotiations have failed. Firstly, we're going to tell you that we don't want negotiations with Assad at all because we want to make Assad step down right from the start. But we're going to give you additional analysis that negotiation is better when Assad is removed. Why is this the case? Because even if we go by their own logic, that they have so many different aims as well as opinions within society and these rebel groups, negotiation is going to be better when we are able to take into account the views of these rebel groups as well within the fold of negotiation. And that can only happen when Bashar al-Assad is removed within society. Go, sir.
We believe that Bashar al-Assad acts as a figurehead for all the Sunni Alawite minorities living in Syria. Why should he not be included in negotiations?
We don't believe that Bashar al-Assad can actually represent anyone. In fact, he oppresses every single group and only acts in self-interest, giving his characterization as a dictator, power-hungry. He doesn't represent anyone. He actually represents himself and himself only. That's why he cannot take into account the 23 different opinions of these rebel groups. He will never be able to do so given this context. On the second idea, on the idea of regional stability, here was extremely poorly responded when it just simply told us that rebels will seize control and commit more atrocities. We already told you that firstly they won't because they will adhere to international standards. But we're going to tell you why it's even worse under opposition side. Because under opposition side, these rebels will be further incentivized to carry out more acts of atrocities because of the hypocrisy of the West. When the West is seen as the bastion of human rights, but yet at the same time refuse to intervene within Syria, no thank you, sir, because of the fact that they see that it's going, because they just refuse to do so, it will simply make these rebel groups even angrier to see that the international community refuses to affirm their beliefs within Syria. And that's why it would make them even more angry and therefore simply have more bloodshed. No thank you, sir. On the next idea, when they told us about splintering groups within Syria, we already told you, firstly, Assad is the common unifying goal for all these people. Secondly, they told us about different modus operandi. We're going to tell you that employing different tactics is good because it means that there's a diversification within the war, and all these different tactics is better in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. And what the West does is affirm all these groups within their different tactics to ensure that they will help these groups to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Conversely, under opposition, they do nothing at all. And this is where our substantive on upholding international law was completely dropped under opposition, and therefore they would simply abandon things like the Geneva Conference under opposition because they fear that Assad will go away and splintering groups will come into power. This is something the international community has never ever once stood for and they cannot stand for. On the attention on what's best for the future. And this was our first substantive on an unhealthy precedent. Here was where they completely dropped the substantive and told us that it's not the role of Western powers because they had shady negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not get the proposition wrong. We don't stand for these shady negotiations as well. But what we do stand for is that the Western powers should intervene in Syria in order to do what's best for the people. Simply saying that isn't enough. Yes, sir.
If all these Western powers have all these hypocritical relations going on by the side, what gives them the legitimacy to intervene in Syria in the first place?
We don't think that what they did was in the side actually matters, because all that matters is they actually intervene now to ensure that what they do currently in the present best helps the people. What they did in the past is separate and disanalogous from what these individuals are going to do within Syria. Now let's move on to the second idea on the best way to foster a good relationship. No, thank you, sir. With the Islamic world was an idea completely dropped by opposition. This is important because military support means that you don't anger these Islamic groups, but rather you support them, and therefore it works into a better relationship, not so antagonistic and not so hostile, and that's even better. On the second idea, which was their second substantive on the creation of fundamental improvement. Here was the example of the Afghanistan war. Those things were completely different. Why is this the case? The second Afghanistan war was a proxy war, but the USA intervened in order to further their own self-interest of fighting against the communists only. This is different in this case because they're intervening to help the people. And why was this different? Because the Mujahideen were aware of the fact that they were being made use of by the USA to further their own self-interest. This is different in this case because the USA is intervening in other Western powers as well to help them, and therefore they will be rational enough to do this. And on the last idea of internationalizing the conflict, we've already told you that that's bad thing that Russia and China refused to intervene given the current situation. This was something never once responded to. Down the line, therefore they concede. Therefore, because the crime of omission is the same as a crime of commission, we cannot have the hands of blood of so many on our hands. I am proud to stand on proposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
I thank the speaker for her speech. May I now call upon the third speaker of the opposition to give his speech.
Today, we think that side proposition sounds very much like the rebel groups themselves. They are saying, kill Assad, it doesn't matter the cost. We just have to kill him and we will have peace, we will all be happy, it will all be fine. Whereas we think that that's simply not true. Now, two questions for the House today. On which side can minimize bloodshed? And on second, on how this will affect the relations of the West. On the very first and main area of contention, on which side can minimize bloodshed? Well, we have told you many times that these rebels themselves are not exactly the nice guys. They themselves are engaged in much human rights violations, killing people, killing our wives, slaughtering innocents. And in any case, they have come out and told us, well, their reply to that was simply that, well, Assad is doing the same. That Assad is even worse. Assad is killing even more people than they are. Well, on the first level, we tell you that Assad is moderating because we are not intervening in this conflict. That was the very deal we made with Assad. No, thank you. With Assad, with the chemical weapons deal. The US told him that we will not strike, we will not use air strikes to destroy your chemical weapon plants, but in return, you have to stop using them. And that was the deal to be made. And we see that, yes, they come up with some examples that, apparently Assad is still using chlorine on his people, but we tell them to begin with, that is even a very contentious point, that there are as many people saying it's Assad as there are people saying who are rebels who very much actually want to bait the Western powers into intervening by blowing out all of these chemical weapons attacks. And in any case, we say that even if we agree and say that both sides are violating human rights a whole time, we tell you that the simple solution is to simply stop the war. Because Bashar al-Assad, a big reason why he's being so radical, a big reason why he's using chemical weapons, slaughtering innocents, massacring people, it's all because there's a war going on, ladies and gentlemen. People's lives are at stake. His power is at stake. And the rebels themselves, their own agendas are at stake. That is why both sides are resorting to such means. And so we say that on their side, when they lengthen the war, no thank you ma'am, all of these human rights violations will continue, will extend both on the sides of the rebels and on Bashar al-Assad. Whereas on our side, and in fact they have even considered that the rebels are the ones losing. The Bashar al-Assad is in fact on the verge of winning, and we see that in fact because of that, we see that these negotiations are actually looking more and more likely. They gave us an example of Homs. We tell you that at Homs, no thank you ma'am, alright, wait a moment ma'am. We tell you that at Homs, what happened was that Bashar al-Assad told the rebels that actually, if you give us this city, you can leave. He didn't go all out and slaughter all of them. He decided to in fact make a treaty with them over that. This shows that in fact moderating, and so long that he gets what he wants, which is to remain in power, he's very much agreeable to a peace deal. Yes ma'am?
You just conceded that Assad only wants to remain in power. Therefore, your solution to stopping the war is suppressing the people even more, allowing Bashar to affirm his power.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Bashar al-Assad wants to remain in power as much as the rebel groups want to take power. We don't see why there's anything wrong with that. And in fact, what we have already told you previously is about how Bashar al-Assad is important in representing all the Alawites, the Sunni minorities. That part of the reason why this war even started in the first place is in fact the very fact that Bashar al-Assad was having favorable policies towards these people. And in fact, many of these rebel groups are in fact hate him for that. They hate the Alawites to that. And so with here, they said that Bashar al-Assad, sorry, first let me deal with this funny part of their policy when they talk about the rules of engagement, thinking that they will solve any problems with human rights violation on the rebel side. We say this is utterly ludicrous. Al-Qaeda is not going to listen to your rules of engagement, ladies and gentlemen. You say that is ludicrous. You try that with the Taliban, and what do? They crash a plane into your building. They are not going to listen to you.
Point of information, sir.
No, thank you, sir. And in any case, let's say we assume that their mechanism is that you give them some weapons, and you tell them that unless you follow us, unless you listen to us, we will stop giving you weapons. Well, we say that even on that case, by the fact that you start giving them weapons in the first place, that will actually cause a whole. You will in fact, because when US even starts giving gives the rebel side any weapons, you see that China and Russia will very much take that as an invitation to support Assad's regime as they have been doing in the past. And that's what my previous speaker have told you. That's what they never responded to. That China and Russia is very much on Bashar al-Assad's side. They actually like Bashar al-Assad. The reason why they are not giving Bashar al-Assad tanks is because US is not giving the rebels guns. That was the deal. And we say that what they are doing is to mess up this entire agreement. But okay, so let us now consider, they told us, as I told you in my introduction, the logic they are trying to tell us is that if the rebels take power, everything will be fine. Now, let's examine whether that is true. They told us that we told you that the rebel factions are very fragmented. They all have their different goals. As a matter of fact, the rebels, okay, does everyone here know that actually the rebels to begin with, they were actually winning the war against Assad's government? The reason why they are in this direction now is because they fell into infighting, because they started killing each other. These are your united rebels, ladies and gentlemen. And in any case, they told us that the rebels are united by their hatred for Assad, because they all are united, they want to overthrow
Point of
Assad.
information, sir.
Alright, yes sir?
Going by your side's logic, you would abandon any and all attempts to uphold the Geneva Convention. How is this good?
Thank you, sir. We say that when both sides are equally, we say that in fact, we have already told you that on our side, we are minimizing the violation of human rights. I've been telling you that for the past 5 minutes of my speech. So your eye has already been answered. But in any case, if indeed Assad is responsible, if all the rebel groups are united for their hatred of Assad, what happens when Assad is dead and gone, and what kind of government will they form? A fragmented government, ladies and gentlemen, when the only reason for their unity has been taken away in the form of Assad, the government they form will be fragmented, will be disunited, they will be infighting yet again. And so we say that even if the rebels do take power thanks to them, peace will not be attained. And of course, just on this little question about Western relations. Now, we have already told you that this policy of theirs will cause China and Russia, will cause relations between China and Russia and the US deteriorate even more. And we tell you that this is especially bad given recent events like those at Sankaku or those over at Crimea. That relations, there's really much tension and we don't want to add that. And of course, on their point about relations between the West and the Islamic groups, now we tell you that just because you give some guns to to one particular cell, Al-Qaeda, doesn't mean the whole Qaeda will be happy at you. Firstly, yeah, because they are fragmented to begin with, and because in any case, we have tried this with the Taliban. They took your guns, and like I said, they crashed a plane into your building. So we say their logic was ridiculous to begin with. And so, because we are the side that minimizes bloodshed and attains peace the quickest, please go with side opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 21 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the reply speaker of the opposition to give his speech to conclude his team's case for the debate.
Members of this House, let not proposition fool us into thinking that the opposition today stands for human rights violation and the abuse of Assad's power. That was not what we said, or that was not what we meant when we said that Assad should stay in power. What we meant was that we need a figure accountable, and we would condemn all human rights abusers because we stand by the fact that there's a universal figure or a leader to hold accountable when crimes has been committed, but we don't stand by the values that he embodies, right? That's why right in first substantive speaker, I told you that we would urge Assad to stop any violence or human rights abuses through Russia, a mechanism in which we gave you that because Russia and China is being pressured by the US that they necessarily stop Syria and Assad from carrying out any future human rights violation, right? That is the mechanism which we stood for. So let us look at what the current situation is like. I'm going to ask that first question. Now on our side, we told you clearly that negotiations are working with the moderate groups actively participating, and Assad has compromised in numerous number of circumstances. We saw the foreign minister Bashar Jafari promising change, promising elections which was legitimate, which they haven't proven to us was rigged whatsoever, right? And on their side, they've given us the example of chlorine gas against rebels and strongholds in Homs being captured. Like what Dion has said, firstly, it's unclear who the perpetrators and actual parties are. But we see through negotiations and compromise in terms of surrendering chemical weapons that Assad is a man who was sincere in his actions, who was willing to compromise. They've accused Assad of being evil, but we think that because of geopolitical pressure, as I've mentioned before, from the US on Russia and China, that Assad necessarily has to obey, right? That when you fund all these rebel groups, you necessarily undermine negotiations that have taken place up till now. So I ask the second question now, what rebels are like? On our side, we are more nuanced. We acknowledge that there are more radical groups and more moderate groups. And the radical groups particularly, because they fought hard and lost men, would want their cause to be seen. Causes like seeing the entire Alawite race being wiped out. We don't think it's a legitimate cause. On their side, rebels are obedient groups that comply by international standards of engagement. Wow. So then I move on to the question of what the consequences of arming rebels are. Firstly, we've told you about more bloodshed. Secondly, we've told you about creation of fundamentalist group. And thirdly, we've told you about internationalizing the conflict. So firstly, on more bloodshed, we told you that you prolong the entire conflict when you arm the rebels and force China and Russia to arm the Assad regime. They've never really engaged in that. And in fact, we say human rights violation happens on our side. We can blame Assad for it and ask him to make corrections. If it happens on their side, where you don't know who or which rebel sect is carrying out these human rights abuses, there's no one to hold accountable. That's what I told you why accountability is so important in my first speaker speech. Then the second point I talked to you about in my substantive was the creation of fundamentalist groups, right? We told you, the reason I gave you was that because you give them arms and training, then you equip them with the ability to harm. The third speaker, very late, was reduced into saying that because we are helping Syrians and we are kind to Syrians, that Syrians don't necessarily become terrorists and or fundamentalists afterwards. Right? We disagree with that. Firstly, we've told you that all these groups have fundamentalist aims to begin with, and when you equip that, it becomes very dangerous. The third point on internationalizing the conflict, they've never really dealt with it. We've told you that when you arm the rebels, the China and Russia will arm the Assad regime, right? Because that's what China and Russia have principally stood for in the United Nations Security Council, with vetoing resolutions that pertain to intervention in Syria, right? The third speaker told us point blank that they want China and Russia to intervene. They want China and Russia to support the Assad regime. We feel that it's on their side, right? That this situation, when it's internationalized, gets really bloody and gets a lot of people involved. Because our side is the more humane side, please stand with our side.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 8 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the reply speaker of the proposition to give his speech to conclude his team's case and the debate as a whole.
I don't even think it's necessary to mention the incredible amount of straw manning, late advances, and complete misrepresentations which were present throughout the third speech and the reply speech. But nonetheless, if you look at opposition's case, inherently they were proud to stand by previous and continued human rights abuses perpetrated by the Assad regime against rebels and the entirety of the population, because they believe that supporting Assad would suddenly erase 3 years of toil and bloodshed on the part of rebels and suddenly make them willing to compromise, cooperate, and negotiate. Clearly, they live in a very different world than the rest of us lived in. At the start of the debate, we told you very clearly that how we're going to judge this debate was based on what was principally in our duty to do so as an international community, and in particular Western powers, and second, what are the practical ramifications of it. And therefore, those are going to be the two areas of clash where I'm going to show you why proposition has taken this debate. So first, is military support something which is principally justified? Literally, opposition's only principal grounding for their case was this, that because Western powers have supported dictators in the past, therefore it should be okay to support Assad now. No, our response was very simple from the start. We told you that yes, those instances of supporting dictators were mistakes. And yes, just because you made a mistake doesn't mean that you continue making that mistake over and over again, especially when it means that in the current day, you cause a lot more harm. That was the principal grounding of our case. Then they completely ignored throughout their case. The only response was that, oh, rebels have been guilty of some human rights violations as well. Apart from the fact that they gave us incredibly counterfactual logic and history, such as how civilian rebels somehow have access to chemical weapons. We told you very clearly that their logic at best meant that they either had to support both sides or support none of them at all. They didn't give any concrete rationale for why they should therefore support Assad, who had also been committing human rights violations, similarly to the rebels which they accused them of. Clearly, they weren't very sure of their stance and had no principal grounding for this. Why was this important? Because the question therefore became, how do we change these human rights violations? And that was what we had on the proposition. Because we told you that when we arm rebels, our policy meant that we tie this to abiding by international law. And yes, we realized some groups like the Al-Qaeda might exist. For those ones, we don't give them help. But for the rest of them that did commit to abiding by these international principles, we did give them these arms, and they were willing to abide by international principles of engagement because this was support which was necessary to help them win their fight in the first place. This was why my substantive on upholding international law was something which is incredibly important and completely unfair and terrible for them to dismiss as a red herring. Why was this the case? Because we told you that by upholding international law, it's not just good for people in Syria now, but also good for people who live in dictatorships across the world now and in the future. Because we set a precedent for interaction, how we're going to be treating these people. This was completely dropped by their side. They can't take this in today's debate. Therefore, on this entire notion of principle grounding and why the duty of Western powers to intervene through military support, we took this debate. Second clash, or what were the practical ramifications? Now, most of their case was about fundamentalist groups. Well, we told you very clearly from the start that we did give them conditional support. What happened to these fundamentalist groups on their side of the house? When they supported Assad, they, number one, increased the number of fundamentalist groups which are occurring and present within Syria because they were angry that Assad was still in power, something that they've been fighting against for the past 3 years. But more importantly, there were also more fundamentalist groups who were turned against the West, and this meant more terrorist activity, more resentment towards the West, and that means in the future, you'd have a much worse relationship with the West. This is where my substantive again fit in on the better relationship with the Islamic world, again, something which they completely dropped. Now, they resorted to terrible things, such as straw-manning our argument about terrorism, or a late advance showing that China and Russia would need to support Syria somehow. Well, very clearly, we buffered this out straight from the start in our first and second speakers, when we told you that no, it's a bad thing that they don't want to take a stand against Syria. Therefore, it is the duty of Western powers, possibly not through the UN, but through NATO, for instance, to act against this and to take a concrete stance against Syria and Assad regime by arming rebels, because this was necessary to protect them and to save lives. Therefore, because we actually stood in line with what was internationally recognized as law and principles that we all abide by, and because we actually saved Syrians living in Syria, we were incredibly proud to stand in proposition.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. The chief adjudicator has announced that this is no longer a silent round. So the adjudicators will deliberate the scores now, and we request for the teams and members of the audience to